The old bus wheezed to a stop in front of the Grand Theater, and 12-year-old David stepped down carefully, his white cane tapping against the sidewalk. His grandmother Rosa took his arm gently, guiding him through the crowd of well-dressed people heading toward the impressive building. "Tell me what it looks like, Grandma," David whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Rosa squeezed his hand. "Oh, child, it's like a palace. Tall white columns reach up to the sky, and there are golden lights everywhere. People are walking up red carpeted steps, all dressed in their finest clothes." David had been looking forward to this evening for months. Rosa had worked extra shifts at the laundry just to save enough money for 2 tickets to see the famous European pianist perform. She knew how much music meant to her grandson, even though they could barely afford the cheapest seats in the back. As they climbed the steps, David heard whispers around them. Some people seemed surprised to see them there. He felt eyes on him as his cane swept back and forth, helping him navigate the unfamiliar space. "Are you sure we belong here, Grandma?" David asked quietly. "We belong anywhere music is played, baby," Rosa replied firmly, though David could hear the slight tension in her voice. Inside the theater lobby, the sounds were magical. Voices echoed off high ceilings, and David could hear the faint notes of a piano being tuned somewhere in the distance. Those distant piano notes made his fingers twitch unconsciously. Ever since he was tiny, music had been his language, his way of understanding the world. At home, David spent hours at the old beat-up piano in their church basement. Half the keys stuck, and it was horribly out of tune, but David didn't mind. He could hear the music as it should sound in his head, even when the piano couldn't produce it properly. Pastor Williams had found the old instrument in someone's garage and thought it might be useful for church services. Instead, it became David's whole world. David had never had a real piano lesson. He couldn't afford them, and besides, most music teachers in their neighborhood didn't know how to work with a blind student. But somehow music just made sense to him. When he heard a song on the radio, he could sit down and play it back perfectly, finding all the right notes by feel and sound. "This way, honey." Rosa guided him through the crowd toward their seats. David noticed how the conversation seemed to quiet as they passed. He was used to this reaction from people who weren't sure how to act around someone who was blind. But tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like they were being judged for more than just his disability. Their seats were in the very back of the theater, but David didn't mind. He wasn't here to see anyway. He was here to listen, to experience the kind of professional music he'd only heard on scratchy radio broadcasts. As they settled in, David heard a woman behind them whisper to her companion, "I wonder what they're doing here. This isn't exactly their kind of event." Rosa pretended not to hear, but David felt her back straighten. She had saved and sacrificed to give him this experience, and no one was going to make them feel unwelcome. "Tell me about the stage, Grandma," David said, trying to distract both of them from the uncomfortable whispers. "There's a beautiful black piano right in the center," Rosa described softly. "It's so shiny it reflects all the lights. The stage is huge with red curtains on the sides, and there are flowers everywhere." David closed his eyes and tried to picture it. In his mind, he could see the grand piano waiting like a sleeping giant, ready to come alive with music. He wondered what it would feel like to touch those keys, to make music on an instrument that was actually in tune, that responded properly to every touch. The theater began to fill up around them. David listened to the conversations flowing around him, picking up fragments about the famous pianist they'd all come to hear. Victor Kozlov was apparently one of the most celebrated classical musicians in the world, known for his powerful performances and his demanding personality. "He's supposed to be incredible," someone nearby said. "But I heard he's quite particular about his audiences. Very traditional, you know." David wasn't sure what traditional meant in this context, but something about the way it was said made him uneasy. As the lights dimmed and the audience grew quiet, David felt his heart racing with excitement. This was it, his first real classical concert. He'd dreamed of this moment, imagined what it would be like to hear professional music performed live instead of through their old radio. The pianist walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. David couldn't see him, but he could hear the confidence in his footsteps. the way he acknowledged the audience before taking his seat at the piano. Then the music began. From the very first note, David was transported. The piano sang with a clarity and richness he'd never experienced before. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped with incredible skill. David found himself leaning forward, his whole body responding to the music. Without thinking, his fingers began moving in his lap, following along with the melody. Rosa noticed and smiled, watching her grandson's face light up with pure joy. This was why she'd worked those extra shifts, why she'd saved every penny. To see David experience music like this was worth everything. As the first piece ended and applause filled the theater, David whispered to his grandmother, "I can play that." Rosa looked at him with gentle love. "I know you can, baby. I know you can." But David meant something more than just being able to reproduce the notes. Listening to this professional performance, he understood something new about music. He heard layers and subtleties he'd never noticed before. The way the pianist shaped each phrase, the timing, the emotion behind every note. It was like discovering a new language he was already fluent in. During the brief pause between pieces, David heard that distant piano tuning again. Someone was working on another piano somewhere in the building, and those simple random notes called to him like a siren song. The second piece began, something by Chopin that David recognized from the radio. But hearing it live was completely different. The music seemed to flow directly into his soul, speaking to something deep inside him that he'd never been able to put into words. As the evening progressed, David became more and more entranced. He forgot about the uncomfortable whispers, forgot about being different, forgot about everything except the incredible music filling the air around him. For the first time in his young life, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Little did he know that the real adventure was just beginning. When intermission arrived, the theater lights came up and conversations buzzed throughout the grand hall. David sat still for a moment, his mind still floating in the beautiful music he'd just heard. The melodies seemed to echo in his thoughts, each note perfectly preserved in his memory. "Would you like to stretch your legs, honey?" Rosa asked, standing and smoothing down her best dress. "Maybe get some fresh air in the lobby?" David nodded, using his cane to feel his way into the aisle. As they walked toward the lobby, he could hear fragments of conversations about the performance. People seemed impressed with the first half of the concert, though some comments made him uncomfortable. "Quite a refined audience tonight," someone said nearby. "Just the sort of people who can truly appreciate this level of artistry." In the lobby, David became aware of that piano sound again. The tuning notes were clearer now, coming from somewhere off to the side. Without really thinking about it, he began moving toward the sound, his cane tapping softly on the marble floor. "David, where are you going?" Rosa called, but she was momentarily distracted by someone asking about the restroom location. David followed the sound down a side hallway, drawn by an irresistible pull. The piano notes grew clearer and more distinct. Someone was definitely working on an instrument, probably preparing it for a later performance, or perhaps for the main pianist's return. Around a corner, David found himself in a smaller space that felt like a side rehearsal room. The piano sounds were coming from right in front of him. He reached out carefully and felt the smooth, cool surface of another grand piano. For a moment, David just stood there, his hands resting lightly on the instrument's case. This piano felt different from the old one at church. The wood was perfectly smooth, and even without touching the keys, he could sense the quality of the instrument. Unable to resist, David felt his way around to the bench and sat down. His fingers found the keys, and immediately he could tell this was something special. The keys responded to his lightest touch, and the sound that came out was pure and clear, nothing like the muddy tones of the church piano. David began to play, softly, just a simple melody he'd learned by ear from the radio. But on this instrument, even the simple tune sounded magical. The notes seemed to float in the air, each one crystal clear and perfectly pitched. As he played, David became lost in the music again. He moved into a more complex piece, something he'd heard during the first half of the concert. His fingers found the notes instinctively, translating what his ears had heard into movement and sound. "What do you think you're doing?" The harsh voice cut through David's playing like a knife. He stopped immediately, his hands jerking back from the keys as if they'd been burned. I said, "What are you doing?" The voice was closer now, and David could hear anger in every word. "Get away from that."
Piano immediately.
David stood up quickly, nearly knocking over the bench. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to." "You just wanted to what?" The voice belonged to a man with a slight accent, probably European. "That is a professional instrument, not some toy for children. To bang on!" David heard footsteps approaching and other voices joining in. People were gathering, drawn by the commotion. His heart began racing as he realized he was in serious trouble. "I wasn't hurting anything," David said quietly, his voice shaking. "I was just playing." "Playing?" The man's voice rose. "You call that playing? Young man, do you have any idea what this instrument is worth? What it means to have the privilege of performing on such a piano?" More people had arrived now. David could hear whispers and murmurs around him. Someone said, "That's Viktor Kozlov, the pianist from tonight's performance." David's stomach dropped. The famous musician he'd been so excited to hear was now standing over him, furious that he'd touched the piano. "I'm very sorry, sir," David managed to say. "I didn't mean any harm. I love music, and when I heard the piano I couldn't help myself." "Couldn't help yourself?" Kozlov's voice was cold and dismissive. "That is exactly the problem with people like you. No respect, no understanding of proper behavior. This is a serious cultural institution, not some street corner where anyone can do whatever they please." David felt tears starting to sting his eyes. The way the man said "people like you" made it clear this wasn't just about touching the piano. This was about who David was, where he came from, and whether he belonged in this fancy theater at all. The boy wasn't doing any damage, someone in the small crowd said softly, but they were quickly shushed by others. "Damage?" Kozlov repeated. "The damage is to the dignity of this institution. This is precisely why we have rules, why we maintain standards. These instruments are for trained professionals, not for random children who wander in off the street." David wanted to explain that he hadn't wandered in off the street, that he had a ticket just like everyone else, that his grandmother had worked extra jobs to afford it. He wanted to tell them that music was his whole world, that he understood it better than most people understood their own native language. But the words wouldn't come. The shame and embarrassment were too overwhelming. "Where are your parents?" Kozlov demanded. "Someone needs to teach you proper respect." "I'm here with my grandmother," David whispered. "Well, she clearly hasn't done her job," Kozlov said coldly. "Security should escort you both out immediately. This is not the place for people who don't understand how to behave appropriately. Then Rosa appeared, having followed the sound of voices and commotion. "David, there you are, honey. What's happening here?" David heard her approach, and he could tell from her voice that she sensed the tension in the room immediately. "Ma'am," Kozlov addressed her with barely concealed irritation, "your grandson has been disturbing our pre-performance preparations by playing on professional equipment without permission. This is completely unacceptable behavior." Rosa moved closer to David, and he felt her protective presence beside him. "I'm sure he didn't mean any harm, sir. David loves music more than anything in the world." "Love of music is not enough," Kozlov replied sharply. "Proper training, proper respect, proper understanding of one's place. These things matter. You cannot simply allow a child to touch expensive instruments because he claims to love music." David could hear the judgment in the man's voice, and he could sense the crowd's agreement. Several people murmured their support for the famous pianist's position. "These pianos are not toys," Kozlov continued, his voice carrying to everyone in the growing crowd. "They are precision instruments meant for serious musicians who have dedicated their lives to the art. When random people treat them as playthings, it shows a fundamental lack of respect for the music itself." Rosa's voice was quiet but steady when she replied, "We paid for our tickets just like everyone else, sir. We have every right to be here. Having a ticket does not give you the right to touch whatever you please," Kozlov shot back. "There are rules, standards of behavior that civilized people understand instinctively." The word civilized hung in the air like a challenge. David felt his grandmother's hand tighten on his shoulder, and he knew she understood exactly what the pianist was really saying. "We'll go back to our seats now," Rosa said with quiet dignity. "Come on, David." As they turned to leave, David heard Kozlov say to someone nearby, "This is exactly what happens when you lower standards. Soon everyone will think they can just walk in here and do whatever they want." The walk back to their seats felt endless. David could sense people staring, whispering about what had happened. The shame burned in his chest, but underneath it was something else, a determination that surprised him with its intensity. As they settled back into their seats for the second half of the concert, David made a silent promise to himself. Someday, somehow, he would show them all what real music could sound like. As David and Rosa made their way back through the lobby, still stinging from the harsh encounter, a gentle voice called out behind them. "Excuse me, please wait a moment." They turned to find a woman approaching them. David could hear kindness in her voice, something that felt like a cool breeze after the burning embarrassment they'd just experienced. "My name is Dr. Helen Chang," the woman said softly. "I'm a music professor at the conservatory downtown. I witnessed what happened back there, and I owe you both an apology." Rosa shifted uncomfortably. "You don't owe us anything, ma'am. We probably shouldn't have—" "No," Dr. Chang interrupted gently but firmly. "What happened was wrong, completely wrong. And what I heard before it was interrupted was remarkable." David felt his cheeks burn. "You heard me playing?" "I did," Dr. Chang said, and David could hear the excitement building in her voice. "I was walking past that rehearsal room when I heard someone playing a piece from tonight's program. But it wasn't just playing, it was interpreting, adding layers and emotions I hadn't noticed when Mr. Kozlov performed it earlier." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. A real music professor thought his playing was good? "When I looked in," Dr. Chang continued, "I saw a young man who had clearly never seen the sheet music, playing entirely by ear, and yet capturing the essence of the composition in a way that many trained pianists never achieve." Rosa squeezed David's shoulder. She'd always known her grandson was special, but hearing it from someone with credentials felt like a miracle. "Ma'am," Rosa said hesitantly, "that's very kind of you to say, but David's never had proper lessons. We can't afford—" "That's exactly what makes it so extraordinary," Dr. Chang said. "David, how long have you been playing?" "Since I was about 5, David replied quietly. "There's an old piano at our church, and Pastor Williams lets me practice on it. But it's not very good, and I know I'm not playing the right way or anything." Dr. Chang was quiet for a moment, and David wondered if she was changing her mind about his abilities. "Would you be willing to play something for me now?" she asked finally. "There's a small upright piano in the theater office that I could access. Nothing fancy, but it's in tune." David looked toward his grandmother, unsure. After what had just happened, the thought of touching another piano in this building felt terrifying. "It's okay, honey," Rosa said, sensing his hesitation. "This lady seems different." Dr. Chang led them down a different hallway to a small office space. True to her word, there was a modest, upright piano tucked into one corner. It wasn't grand or intimidating like the other instruments. It looked more like something David could actually belong with. "Play anything you'd like," Dr. Chang said, settling into a chair nearby. "Whatever feels right to you." David sat down at the bench and let his fingers rest on the keys for a moment. The piano was indeed in tune, and the keys responded nicely to his touch. After the harsh confrontation, he felt nervous about making any sound at all. But then he thought about the music he'd heard during the first half of the concert. One piece in particular had stayed with him, a beautiful flowing melody that seemed to tell a story of hope and sadness all at once. David began to play, starting softly. The melody emerged from his fingers as if it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to come out. But as he played, he found himself adding his own touches, a different rhythm here, a harmony there, small changes that felt right to him. As the music developed, David forgot about his nervousness. He forgot about Kozlov's harsh words and the staring crowd. He fell into that familiar place where only the music mattered, where his fingers knew exactly what to do without his brain having to tell them. When he finished, the silence stretched for several seconds. David worried that maybe Dr. Chang had changed her mind, that maybe his playing really was as inappropriate as Kozlov had suggested. "David," Dr. Chang said finally, and her voice was thick with emotion. "That was a very complex piece of classical music. You played it not just accurately but with genuine musical understanding. How is that possible when you've never seen the sheet music?" I listen, and then I can hear it in my head," David explained, struggling to put something so natural into words. "It's like the music tells me where it wants to go next." Dr. Chang stood up and began pacing the small room. "This is extraordinary. What you have is called perfect pitch, combined with an intuitive understanding of musical structure that most people spend years trying to develop. You're not just playing notes, you're thinking like a composer." David didn't fully understand what she meant, but her excitement was infectious. "Rosa," Dr. Chang turned to his grandmother, "I want to ask you something, and please know that I'm completely sincere. Would you allow me to work with David? To give him some formal training?" Rosa's face showed both hope and worry. "Ma'am, that's incredibly generous, but we can't pay for lessons. I work at the laundry and money is always tight." "I'm not asking for payment," Dr. Chang said quickly. "I'm asking for the opportunity to work with someone who has a gift I've rarely encountered in 20 years of teaching. David, would you be interested in learning more about music theory? About the technical aspects of what you're already doing so naturally?" David felt his heart racing. Real music lessons? From a real professor? It seemed too good to be true. "But what about what happened tonight?" David asked. "That man said I don't belong in places like this." Dr. Chang's voice hardened slightly. "Mr. Kozlov was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. Music doesn't belong to people like him. It belongs to people like you, people who understand it from the inside out. What you have can't be taught, David. What I can teach you is how to refine it, how to share it with the world in ways that will make it impossible for anyone to dismiss." She paused, then continued with growing enthusiasm. "In fact, I have an idea. The theater sometimes hosts young artist showcases, small performances designed to give new talent exposure. What if we worked together for a few months and then you performed here? Showed everyone what real musical understanding sounds like?" David couldn't speak. The idea of performing on a real stage, in front of a real audience, seemed like something from a dream. "Would that be okay, Grandma?" he asked finally. Rosa looked at her grandson's face, seeing hope and excitement shining there for the first time in hours. "If Dr. Chang is willing to work with you, baby, then I think we should say yes." Dr. Chang smiled. "Wonderful. David, I want you to know something. What happened tonight with Mr. Kozlov, that's going to happen again. There will always be people who judge you before they hear you play, who think they know what a musician should look like or where they should come from." She leaned forward, her voice growing serious. "But when you sit down at a piano and make music the way you did just now, none of that matters. The music speaks for itself, and it speaks louder than any prejudice or narrow-mindedness." David nodded, feeling something new growing inside him. It wasn't just excitement about the lessons or the possibility of performing. It was a sense of purpose, a feeling that maybe what had happened tonight wasn't just a humiliation but the beginning of something important. "When can we start?" David asked. Dr. Chang laughed. "How about next Saturday? We'll start with some basic theory, but mostly I want to hear you play. I want to understand how your musical mind works." As they prepared to return to their seats, for the remainder of the concert, David felt like a completely different person than he'd been an hour ago. The same music would be playing, but now he would be listening not just as someone who loved music, but as someone who was going to become a real musician himself. The encounter with Kozlov still stung, but it no longer felt like the end of something. Instead, it felt like the beginning. 3 months had passed since that evening at the theater, and David's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. Dr. Chang had become not just his teacher, but his mentor and advocate. Under her guidance, his natural abilities had flourished and refined into something truly extraordinary. Tonight, David stood in the same theater where he'd been humiliated, but everything was different. Dr. Chang had arranged for him to perform during the theater's monthly Young Artist Showcase, a smaller, more intimate event that highlighted emerging talent. "Remember what we practiced," Dr. Chang whispered as they stood in the wings. "Trust your instincts, trust your preparation, and most importantly, trust the music itself." David nodded, his fingers unconsciously running through the piece he was about to perform. He'd chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Dr. Chang had initially suggested something simpler, but David had insisted. This was the piece that had been playing in his head since that night 3 months ago. The audience tonight was smaller than the one for Kozlov's concert, but David could sense a different energy. These people had come specifically to hear new talent, to discover something unexpected. There were music students, local music lovers, and several professional musicians who regularly attended the showcase series. What David didn't know was that word had quietly spread through the classical music community about the young pianist who'd been working with Dr. Chang. Several people were here specifically to hear him play, including some who had heard exaggerated stories about his abilities and were frankly skeptical. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice carried across the theater, "our next performer is a young musician who has been studying with Dr. Helen Chang from the conservatory. Please welcome David Johnson." David walked carefully onto the stage, his cane tapping softly against the floor. The theater was much quieter than it had been during Kozlov's performance, and he could hear individual whispers and movements from the audience. As he approached the piano bench, David paused for a moment. This was the same type of grand piano he'd been forbidden to touch 3 months ago. But tonight, he belonged here. Tonight, this instrument was waiting for him. David sat down and placed his hands on the keys, feeling their familiar weight and responsiveness. Dr. Chang had arranged for him to practice on this exact piano several times over the past weeks, so it felt like greeting an old friend. He took a deep breath and began. The opening notes of the Chopin Ballade emerged with crystalline clarity, each note perfectly placed and weighted. But from the very beginning, it was clear that this wasn't just a technical performance. David played with an emotional depth that seemed impossible for someone his age. In the audience, conversation stopped entirely. People who had been casually listening, perhaps checking their programs or settling into their seats, found themselves drawn into the music despite themselves. The Ballade No. 1 is a piece that tells a story through sound, moving from gentle, lyrical passages to moments of intense drama and passion. David navigated these changes with intuitive understanding, his playing reflecting not just technical mastery, but genuine comprehension of the music's emotional journey. Halfway through the piece, a figure appeared at the back of the theater. Viktor Kozlov had arrived. He'd come tonight for reasons he couldn't entirely explain to himself. Word had reached him about a young pianist performing at the showcase, and something about the description had nagged at him. When he realized it was the same theater where he'd had that unpleasant encounter months ago, curiosity had gotten the better of him. Now, listening to the music flowing from the stage, Kozlov felt his world shift. This wasn't just accomplished playing, this was artistry of the highest order. The young performer was taking Chopin's already complex composition and revealing layers of meaning that Kozlov himself had never fully explored. The technical aspects alone were staggering. The Ballade No. 1 required incredible finger independence, dynamic control, and rhythmic precision. But beyond technique, the performance demonstrated a musical maturity that typically took decades to develop. As the piece moved into its final section, the music became more intense, more dramatic. David's playing grew more powerful without ever becoming harsh, more passionate without losing its precision. His whole body moved with the music, expressing emotions that seemed to flow directly from his soul through his fingers. In the audience, several people were crying. Others sat completely motionless, afraid that any movement might break the spell being woven around them. When David reached the final notes, The music seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment. The last chord faded slowly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. Then the applause began. It started with one person, then spread rapidly through the small theater until it became thunderous. People rose to their feet, many wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. David sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. He could hear the enthusiasm in the applause, feel the genuine appreciation flowing toward him from the audience. This was nothing like the polite, formal applause he'd heard at other classical concerts. This was personal, emotional, real. From the back of the theater, Kozlov began walking toward the stage. People noticed his approach and began to quiet down, recognizing the famous pianist from his previous performance. David heard the footsteps approaching and felt his heart rate increase. He recognized something familiar about the sound, though he couldn't place exactly what. "Young man," a voice said, and David's blood ran cold. It was the same voice that had humiliated him 3 months ago, the same accent, the same authoritative tone. But when Kozlov continued speaking, his words were nothing like what David expected. "That was one of the most extraordinary performances I have heard in my entire career," Kozlov said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent theater. "I owe you an apology, a profound, heartfelt apology." David sat frozen, unsure how to respond. Kozlov continued, his voice thick with emotion. 3 months ago, I judged you based on my own narrow prejudices and preconceptions. I saw a young man who didn't fit my ideas about what a classical musician should look like, and I responded with cruelty and ignorance. The theater remained completely silent, everyone hanging on every word. "What I just heard," Kozlov said, "was not just technically perfect, though it was that. It was musically profound in a way that humbled me. You didn't just play Chopin's notes, you revealed Chopin's soul. That is something that cannot be taught, only honored." David finally found his voice. "Thank you, sir. That means everything to me." Kozlov stepped closer to the piano. "Would you allow me to shake your hand, and would you perhaps consider performing with me sometime? I believe we could learn from each other." As David stood and extended his hand, the audience erupted in applause again. But this time, David barely heard it. All he could think about was how completely his world had changed in the space of a single performance. Dr. Chang watched from the wings, tears streaming down her face. She had known David was special, but seeing him command the stage with such authority, such pure musical communication, exceeded even her highest expectations. As the applause continued and Kozlov spoke quietly with David at the piano, Dr. Chang knew they were witnessing the birth of something truly remarkable. Not just a talented young musician, but an artist who would change the way people thought about music itself. The boy who had been dismissed and humiliated 3 months ago had just announced himself to the world as a force to be reckoned with. The morning after David's performance, everything changed. Rosa woke up to the sound of their old telephone ringing persistently in the kitchen. By the time she reached it, still in her robe and slippers, it had stopped. But before she could even pour her coffee, it rang again. "Hello?" She answered cautiously. "Mrs. Johnson? This is Patricia Williams from Classical Music Monthly magazine. We're trying to reach David Johnson, the young pianist who performed last night. We'd love to do a feature story." Before Rosa could fully process this call, there was a knock at their front door, then another phone call, then more knocking. Word of David's performance had spread through the classical music world faster than anyone could have imagined. Someone in the audience had recorded part of the performance on their phone and shared it online. By morning, the video had been viewed thousands of times and shared by musicians, music teachers, and classical music enthusiasts around the world. Dr. Chang arrived at their small apartment around noon, carrying a stack of newspapers and looking slightly overwhelmed herself. "David," she said, settling into their modest living room, "I think you need to see this." She opened the morning edition of the city's main newspaper to the arts section. There, taking up half the page, was a review of the previous night's showcase. The headline read, Young pianist delivers performance that redefines musical genius. David listened carefully as Dr. Chang read portions of the review aloud. Words like transcendent, extraordinary, and once-in-a-generation talent seemed to dance in the air around him. But it's not just local attention, Dr. Chang continued, her voice filled with excitement and concern. I've had calls from recording companies, concert halls, and music festivals from across the country. Everyone wants to book you for performances. Rosa looked worried. Is that good or bad? It's both, Dr. Chang admitted honestly. It's wonderful recognition for David's talent, but it's also a lot of pressure for someone so young. We need to be very careful about how we handle this. Over the next few weeks, David's life became a whirlwind of opportunities and decisions. Representatives from major record labels flew in to meet with him. Concert halls that normally booked only the most established artists were offering him performance dates. Music conservatories were extending scholarship offers for full rides. But perhaps the most meaningful call came from Viktor Kozlov himself. David, the famous pianist, said during a visit to their apartment, I want to propose something unusual. I'm planning a tour of major concert halls across the country next year. Instead of performing alone, I'd like you to join me. We could play some pieces together and you could have solo segments as well. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. A major concert tour with one of the world's most respected classical musicians? But why would you want to perform with me? David asked. I'm still just learning. Kozlov smiled. Because you have something that cannot be learned, David. You have a direct connection to the music that most of us spend our entire careers trying to achieve. When you play, you don't just perform the notes, you become the music itself. The tour, when it happened, was unlike anything the classical music world had seen before. David and Kozlov performed in sold-out venues from New York to Los Angeles. Critics struggled to find words to describe the chemistry between the experienced master and the young prodigy. But David never forgot where he came from, or what was truly important to him. During a break in the tour, he returned home and surprised Rosa with an announcement. Grandma, I want to do something with some of the money I've been earning. What's that, honey? I want to start a music program for kids who can't afford lessons. Kids like me. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. Despite all the fame and opportunities, her grandson's heart remained in exactly the right place. Working with Dr. Chang, David established the Music for Everyone Foundation. The program provided free instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities for children from low-income families. They renovated the basement of their old church, replacing David's broken-down practice piano with several beautiful instruments donated by music companies who had heard his story. Every Saturday, David could be found at the church, working with young students who reminded him of himself just a year earlier. Some had disabilities, others came from families struggling to make ends meet, but all of them shared the same love of music that had driven David to touch that piano on the night that changed his life. Music doesn't care where you come from, David would tell his students. It doesn't care what you look like or how much money your family has. Music only cares that you listen with your heart and play with your soul. One Saturday afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at the church. Viktor Kozlov had come to see the program for himself. This is remarkable, David, he said, watching the young students practice on instruments they never could have afforded otherwise. You're not just sharing music, you're sharing opportunity. David smiled. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. Now I want to give that same chance to other kids. As David's reputation grew, he became more than just a performer. He became a symbol of what was possible when talent was nurtured regardless of background or circumstances. His story inspired music programs in schools across the country and challenged the classical music world to examine its own assumptions about who belonged in concert halls. Years later, when David had become one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation, he would still return to that same church basement every Saturday. The walls were now covered with pictures of students who had gone on to music scholarships, professional careers, and their own teaching positions. But the photo that meant the most to David was a simple snapshot taken on the day the program opened. It showed him sitting at the piano with Rosa beside him, both of them smiling as a group of eager young students gathered around. In that photo, David wasn't a famous musician or a classical music sensation. He was just a young man who had been given a chance and was determined to pass that gift forward to others. The inscription below the photo, written in David's own hand, read, "Music belongs to everyone who has the courage to listen and the heart to play." And in the end, that simple truth proved more powerful than any performance, more lasting than any review, and more important than any award. David had learned that the real measure of a musician wasn't just how beautifully they could play, but how many other hearts they could inspire to make music of their own. The boy who had once been told he didn't belong in a concert hall had not only claimed his place there, he had opened the doors for countless others to follow.